And welcome to Hannity, and this is a Fox News alert. High tensions on Capitol Hill today during a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing on the threat that ISIS poses to the homeland. Now, while the top U.S. military leader left the door open to possible boots on the ground to fight against these terrorists, well, protesters, they interrupted the proceeding early and often to voice their opposition to the war. Let's take a look at some of the highlights from today.
Is there any doubt in your mind that if ISIL had the capability to kill millions of Americans, they would do so?
They'll kill anybody who doesn't conform to their narrow ideological bent.
ISIL has global aspirations, and as President Obama has made clear, ISIL's leaders have threatened America and our allies.
Do you know any major Arab ally that embraces ISIL?
I know major Arab allies who fund them.
Thank you. Would you please leave? Would you please leave the room now?
We need to end this
General Dempsey.
This coalition is the appropriate way forward, but if it fails to be true and if there are threats to the United States, then I, of course, would go back to the President and make a recommendation that may include the use of U.S. military ground forces.
You think that these people you're training will only go back to fight against ISIL? Do you really believe that, General?
If the objective were to destroy ISIS within 90 days, what would be required militarily to carry that out?
It's not possible, Senator.
Is it fair to say that if we don't contain this threat and eventually destroy it, that it gets worse over time? And a year from now, if they're still flourishing in Syria and this coalition hadn't come about, America's more in danger of a major attack than we are today?
Yes.
Now, in just a moment, Texas Senator Ted Cruz and Florida Senator Marco Rubio will join me with reaction to that hearing and much more. But first, I wanted to say a few words about the dire situation that ISIS has created for the United States and the world. We are now facing a terrorist organization that is the largest, the best funded, and the best armed in history. Now, it also controls much of two nations, Syria and Iraq. Now, they're at war with the United States. They beheaded Americans. They said they'd meet us in New York. And yet we have a president and an administration whose incompetence is unparalleled in modern American history. In my opinion, it ranks as one of, if not the most inept we've ever had. Now, let me simply focus on the utter chaos related to our policy regarding ISIS. Now, first, remember, when the president discussed this group back in January, he referred to them as the, quote, JV team. Now, that's when mixed messages started flowing from the White House, flipping and flopping and flipping and flopping over what actions should be done in regard to these terror groups. Watch.
Our objective is clear, and that is to degrade and destroy ISIL so that it's no longer a threat, not just to Iraq, but also to the region and to the United States. We know that if we are joined by the international community, we can continue to shrink ISIL's sphere of influence, its effectiveness, its financing, its military capabilities, to the point where it is a manageable problem.
Our objective is clear. We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL.
Now, remember, just a few weeks ago, one of the most embarrassing moments of his presidency, the leader of the free world admitted that he did not have a strategy for defeating ISIS. And not only that, he even acknowledged that because of preconditions that he set himself, America can't possibly defeat the terror network. Now, the confusion may begin at the top, but it does not end there, and that brings me to example number 3. Late last week, Secretary of State John Kerry and National Security Advisor Susan Rice refused to say that we are at war with ISIS. Watch this.
Is the United States at war with ISIS? It sure sounds from the president's speech that we are.
I think that's the wrong terminology. What we are doing is engaging in a very significant counterterrorism operation.
It sounds like a war to me. Is it fair to call it a war?
Well, Wolf, I don't know whether you want to call it a war or a sustained counterterrorism campaign, or I think, frankly, this is a counterterrorism operation that will take time. It will be sustained. We will not have American combat forces on the ground.
Now, the problem is the same day both the White House and the Pentagon said that we were at war with ISIS. So we have multiple voices in the same administration saying the exact opposite thing. Now, example 4. The top U.S. military commander in the Middle East asked for special forces to be sent to the region, but that request was flat out rejected by the president. Instead, 475 more troops are being deployed to help train the Iraqi and Kurdish forces. But is that enough? Well, the answer is no. Now, just this morning, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff put the prospect of boots on the ground, he put it back on the table. Watch this.
My view at this point is that this coalition is the appropriate way forward. I believe that will prove true. But if it fails to be true, and if there are threats to the United States, then I, of course, would go back to the president and make a recommendation that may include the use of U.S. military ground forces.
Now, here's the problem. The president, in order to appease his liberal friends, has already ruled out sending combat forces to battle ISIS. In other words, the commander-in-chief is blatantly handcuffing those military leaders and is jeopardizing this mission in its entirety. Now, quite simply, this president and his half-baked approach are directly at odds with what the generals are now recommending. Now, a fifth and final example, our stated policy right now is that he won't, under any conditions, work with or coordinate his efforts with the brutal Assad regime in Syria. However, we are willing to work with the brutal Islamic regime in Iran, even though Syria takes orders and directions from Tehran. Now, this is utter and complete chaos that we're seeing. Now, this president has gotten lost in a fog of confusion. He's uncertain, he's disoriented, he's weak, and he's afraid. He's half in, he's half out. It is an astonishing display, and one that is totally unnerving to both our allies and our foes, and especially the American people. Now, according to the latest NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, nearly 70% of Americans don't have much confidence that the president will succeed in eliminating ISIS, and only 38% approve of the president's handling of foreign affairs. That is the state of the nation tonight. Here with reaction is Florida Senator Marco Rubio. Senator, what are we to make with what can only be described as utter confusion here and mixed messages? You know, we got one part of the administration saying one thing one day, another thing another day, the president one thing one day, another thing another day. You know, what's going on here?
Well, first let me explain why it's happening, and then I'll tell you what its impact is. The reason why it's happening is because this president ran by basically bragging that he was going to get us out of every conflict on the planet. He was going to disengage us from the Middle East. This is not uncommon among isolationists like himself, people who believe that American engagement is actually the reason why these problems exist. He, in essence, believes it's America's fault in many instances that we have these enemies. And so he's bragged about it for years, and now suddenly reality is forcing him back in. Let me tell you the implications. The implications are that all these other countries we're trying to create a coalition with, especially the Arab countries, they listen to his speeches, but they also listen to this confusion, and what they conclude is we're not really committed to a true anti-Islamic terror campaign. He's going to do what he needs to do in the short term to deal with this, but we're not going to see it through under this president. And so that lack of reliability has really undermined this nation's credibility, and I really think undermines our ability to successfully put together a coalition of nations to confront this threat.
All right. On top of all of this, now the administration said that there's going to be no boots on the ground. And then listen to General Dempsey and what he said, no shock and awe. And I want to ask you if it's possible to win a war, which is, I guess, what some of them are saying, with this policy. Listen to this.
We will be prepared to strike ISIL targets in Syria that degrade ISIL's capabilities. This won't look like a shock and awe campaign because that's simply not how ISIL is organized, but it will be a persistent and sustainable campaign.
Is it possible, I mean, the president stood by and watched city after city that Americans shed their blood and died for be taken over by ISIS. Can you win a war with no boots on the ground, no shock and awe? Is that possible?
No, and then, you know, the generals know that. They're trying to balance between what they know to be right militarily and what the mandates are politically. Here's the challenge, though. They're going to have to be confronted because ISIL isn't just a terrorist group. It's also an insurgency. So they control territory. They operate on the ground. They take control of villages and try to impose Sharia law. They're going to have to be defeated by ground troops. Now, ideally, in a perfect world, they would be local ground troops. They would be Sunnis taking back their villages. They would be Iraqi armed elements. There would be Syrian rebels who are moderate and equipped. That's the ideal outcome. We have to be prepared, however, for the reality that that may not come together in time, that they will have to be confronted. And at that point, the choice we have is the following. If it doesn't work out with these local troops, does ISIL get to stay? Do they continue to be able to operate, or do we truly do what's necessary to defeat them? And this president clearly is looking forward to leaving it to his successor to figure all of that out because, as he has said repeatedly, Americans are not going to do anything anything beyond these airstrikes. I think that's he's not being honest with the American people when he talks about it that way.
We had Senator McCain on last night. He took issue with a report in the Hill and from a humanitarian group on the ground that, in fact, the rebels in Syria have now reached a peace agreement with ISIS. Does that then put in jeopardy any idea of maybe supporting the rebels there with some type of munitions, or should we only offer that to the Kurds? What should we do?
Well, first of all, it is complicated in Syria. One of the reasons why it's so complicated is because had we gotten involved earlier, a year and a half or two, in identifying with moderate groups, it might have been easier to work with them. Not easy, but easier. Unfortunately, time has passed, these groups have degraded, and it may be harder than ever to find groups we can work with. As far as that peace agreement is concerned, there was a couple of reports about that. There are a significant number of reports afterwards that dispute that, including from the Free Syrian Army elements that say that isn't true. I still believe that there are groups that we can work with in Syria, but they need a lot of help. I mean, these groups are smaller than they used to be. They're less equipped. They're poorly funded. That's not going to happen overnight. This is going to take time. And the truth is that the ISIL threat might be moving a lot faster than the capability of these Syrian rebels to keep up. So we should try to do it, but we shouldn't put all our eggs in that basket. It may not come together in time.
And do you believe that ISIS, because of the vulnerability at our border, do you think they would cross there? Because when I was down there and I got a briefing with Governor Perry, I was told that people are coming from Yemen and Syria and Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Right.
Do you think that they're already here in the U.S., or do you think they would use the southern border to cross?
Sure, potentially, but it's not just ISIS. I mean, there are multiple groups around the world that want to strike us. I mean, we forget with all this focus on ISIL, and rightfully so, that there are multiple other groups that are plotting the exact same things. There's a new al-Qaeda affiliate in the Indian Peninsula. There's, the Khorasan group in Syria, which is a very dangerous group. There's al-Nusra. There's all sorts of elements in Pakistan that are extremely dangerous as well. But here's my other point, Sean. They don't have to cross the border. Some of these people, because they hold European passports, and in some instances American passports, can come on an airplane. So yeah. The border is certainly a concern, but so are our airports, because many of them come from visa waiver countries that allow them immediate access to our nation.
All right, Senator, thank you. Appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you, Sean.
And joining me now with more is Texas Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, good to see you.
Sean, it's great to be with you.
All right, maybe you can shed some light. This incoherent message of the administration, very frustrating, and there's a part of me that believes this is also very dangerous. Your reaction?
It's extraordinarily dangerous. From the beginning, President Obama's response to ISIS has been fundamentally unserious. Whether it is golfing while terror attacks, or whether it is admitting candidly to the world that he has no strategy. This administration is not doing the job that we need of a commander-in-chief to defend our nation. Today, we had Secretary Hagel, we had General Dempsey before the Senate Armed Services Committee. I tried to press them hard on the very simple question, if the objective were to destroy ISIS, not to degrade them, not to limit their ability, but to destroy them within 90 days, what would be militarily necessary to do that? And I'm sorry to say neither gentleman could give an answer to that. Indeed, General Dempsey said the military can't do that. It's not a military operation, and their focus, sadly, seems far more focused on issues of political reconciliations, on side issues. I mean, frankly, their answers were far more those you would expect of a social worker than of military leaders.
Senator, I guess that, if you look at the bombings that took place yesterday, so close to Baghdad, but that's only because ISIS has now accumulated all this territory that our troops died fighting for. Where's the sense of urgency? Where's the sense of urgency for securing our border, and we'll get into this with Congressman Gutierrez later, considering that it's so wide open, we're told that people from Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan are coming in. Aren't these problems we need to solve if we want to keep the American people safe?
Absolutely. And you're right. There is no sense of urgency, no sense of seriousness. We've seen ISIS go from roughly 10,000 fighters to now north of 30,000. And the administration's approach, ISIS right now is the face of evil. They are crucifying Christians. They are persecuting Christians. They are beheading children. They have beheaded 2 American journalists on the global stage, and they have promised to take jihad to our shores. And the administration's response, they deal with this as a PR matter. Drop a bomb here, send a missile there. When I asked General Dempsey, militarily, how would we go in and kill the terrorists before they're able to take jihad to America, his answer was, well, we need to see political reconciliation. We need to change the conditions on the ground so people are not susceptible to extremism. Look, it's not our job to be social workers in Iraq and put them all on expanded Medicaid. It is our job to kill terrorists who have declared war on America and who have demonstrated the intention and capability to murder innocent Americans.
And I'd add to that, secure the border?
Absolutely to secure the border. And this is an administration who resolutely refuses to secure the border. I'll tell you, the morale, as you know well, in the Border Patrol is at an all-time low because the political appointees are telling them not to do their job. And Sean, what we ought to see in the Senate this week, I've introduced legislation that provides that any American who takes up arms with ISIS has, through doing so, forfeited his or her U.S. citizenship. We should not be letting people with U.S. passports come back from fighting with ISIS and carry out acts of terror here.
All right. Senator, good to see you. Appreciate it. And we'll have you back soon. Coming up, my exclusive one-on-one interview with President Obama's brother. But first, disturbing images displayed at last week's Muslim parade right here in New York City, plus new warning signs that ISIS is planning to infiltrate our southern border. I'll go one-on-one with Democratic Congressman Luis Gutierrez. That and more as this busy news night on Hannity.